afternoon, Senator Johnson. Good afternoon, Dr. Risch. Thanks a lot for taking the time to speak to us and to our readers in France. You have, Senator Johnson, you have had the courage of bringing to in front of the Senate in the US the topic of early treatment, which is of great interest to a lot of people around the globe. And it's a very courageous move because the hurdle is very high to get this treatment accepted, as we have seen. And I would like to really discuss with you the situation in the US, the treatment, the challenges you face, and also address with you some of the challenges we face in France. So maybe if you can spare the time to explain to us a little bit, what is the US situation that led to the hearing of last week, and what are the outcomes?
Well, first of all, let me state that there's no courage on my part that even begins to compare with the courage of the doctors and nurses who are actually subjecting themselves to the virus and are treating COVID patients. So that is where the real courage resides in people like Dr. Raoult in France, who is now being persecuted because he had the compassion, first the courage to treat patients, then the compassion to go against the grain of all the bureaucrats in their ivory towers that there will never be enough evidence, I guess. But here you have doctors and nurses that are treating patients in the midst of a pandemic that have the courage to practice medicine. That's where the real courage resides. But the situation in America as regards early treatment is probably similar to what it is in France. We're not doing it. And that is what has baffled me since really March, April, the very early months of this pandemic, that there are forces, there are people in these agencies, there are people in the news media that simply, there will be no evidence that will be enough for them to open their minds and take a look at what may work, what is safe, allow doctors to be doctors and let them practice medicine. But, to a certain extent, the US, we have certain laws like right to try that, doctors can utilize their off-label prescription rights, and many of them are doing it if they have the courage to treat COVID patients, if they have the courage to buck the basic narrative going in the media. But that's a minority of doctors in this country. So most Americans are probably having difficulty getting any treatment whatsoever if they come down with a positive COVID test, or if they have the symptoms of COVID. They're basically told, and this is NIH guidelines, and Dr. Risch and the doctors are better capable of talking about this, but basically NIH guidelines, that's our government agencies, basically say, you just got to go home and hopefully you won't get too sick. Hopefully you recover. But if, the point you get sick enough and you require hospitalization, then we'll start treating you. From my standpoint, that is madness. That is insane. And it has cost tens of thousands of people their lives around the world, that type of attitude.
Well, thanks a lot for this. I mean, I think we have the same experience in France. Did you notice, whether it's Harvey Risch maybe, that a physician had pressure to avoid prescribing any form of treatment, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or some macrolides? And also, did you notice whether chemists had difficulties in delivering the drugs?
Well, I think that there is too little evidence on the nature of studies to show that the other drugs, except for perhaps ivermectin, have any sustained established efficacy in early treatment. We know that they do, but this is, as you say, the art and practice of medicine that comes from on-the-ground clinicians actually using drugs and seeing how they work in their patients. We know that steroids have a role in early treatment, not just hydroxychloroquine, not just ivermectin. We know that vitamin D and especially zinc have roles. We have evidence for zinc, for example, in combination with hydroxychloroquine and not necessarily by itself, from the large study in Saudi Arabia, for example. So there is evidence, but basically, I think the whole society has abdicated responsibility for dealing with early outpatient treatment. And I think this came about from something that I said in the hearings, which is that at the very beginning, the idea of treatment of hospital patients and treatment of outpatients was all lumped together and all discarded from hydroxychloroquine. And nobody ever entertained the fact that outpatient treatment was a separate entity because of whatever politicized thinking or externally motivated thinking. And I think that set the stage for why there hasn't been any critical examination of all forms of outpatient treatment.
And when it comes down to the role of the government agencies, whether it's the FDA, the NIAID, the CDC, how do you see the roles that they played in recommendation against early treatment? Do you feel this is still justified, or do they still have some data points to justify this?
They've been guilty of massive conflicts of interest. That the NIH under Dr. Fauci set up a review panel for remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine that had 54 members. Of that panel, 18 had conflicts of interest with pharma companies manufacturing competing products to the hydroxychloroquine, including quite a number, more than half of that, with ties to the company that manufactures remdesivir. That conflict of interest would not be entertained under any ethical system. To have one or two people representing manufacturers is one thing. They provide expertise and knowledge that the manufacturers have that's relevant for discussion. But to have 18 out of 54 is absurd, and it's a major conflict of interest, and under any ethical guidelines would never be tolerated. But somehow this was tolerated by the NIH, by Dr. Fauci's superiors. And one could ask, why was that tolerated and maybe even encouraged? And the answer to that is that NIH has an interest in those products and vaccines, and that's because NIH has profit sharing agreements with vaccine and other manufacturers to develop those products and share in the very large billions of dollars of money to be made on those products. There are patents that come about from NIH investigators that are allowed to share the profits, and NIH as a whole will share profits. And so there's a big financial conflict of interest that overrides what those ethical considerations were for who is on those review panels that provided the guidance to FDA to draw the conclusions that it did.
Mm-hmm. And Senator Johnson, just how are the other senators taking the hearing last week? Are they listening? Are they trying to learn from what you're saying, or they're just passive, I would say?
Well, I've not heard from anybody in the agencies, although I've got direct links. I've texted Dr. Hahn repeatedly, texted him about this hearing. I had heard that the FDA was potentially going to approve some early treatments, but he never got back to me. I think as significant a resistance as we've already experienced, in the early months, again, the fact that these individuals, whether they're in the media, whether they're in medical journals, whether they're the agencies, whether they're doctors, whether they're hospital associations, all those individuals who pretty well lined up in unison, opposed to things like hydroxychloroquine. I think maybe just because President Trump talked about it. I don't have an explanation for this. I mean, one of the things I've talked about was the fact that some of these therapies cost tens of dollars, $20, $30, $40 versus remdesivir, which had a early use authorization or authorization for early use. That costs over $3,000. That's very beneficial, obviously, to some of these drug companies. Is it the financial motive here? I really can't tell you, but I can tell you what's probably the most significant hurdle we have right now about really approving some of these off-the-shelf drugs. I mean, these things are available. Hydroxychloroquine has been prescribed for 65 years safely. It's one of the safest drugs that we have today. And yet those individuals that kept that out of the hands of patients and their doctors and their pharmacists, they're never going to admit they're wrong, because tens of thousands of people have died during this COVID crisis. And if it's ever proven conclusively, and again, I think Dr. Risch can speak to this, I really can't, but to the extent that we have conclusive proof, they will never admit it, because tens of thousands of people have died from lack of early treatment.
And so therefore, at some point, someone will be seeking the responsibility of some of these people, but they will be pretty hard to find, I guess, or pretty lengthy.
Well, yeah, when you see the news coverage of our hearing, which I thought was very balanced. You know, I set out at the onset of the hearings, I didn't want this about hydroxychloroquine. I want this as a discussion about early treatments. And why have we spent billions? Why have we spent all the time and effort as we have in terms of developing vaccine for early treatments, which would have been as effective, maybe not more effective, at ending this crisis? But you see the news media reporting on this. It's not surprising, but it's still shocking that they completely ignored the experts that I had, people like Dr. Harvey Risch, you know, Yale professor of epidemiology, 71 years old, been involved in this for decades. Dr. George Fareed, 50 years practicing medicine, Harvard trained. Dr. Peter McCulloch, vice chief of medicine at Baylor University, professor at Texas A&M University. These people's, you know, my witnesses, these eminent doctors and scientists, they were ignored in this press. And all the press does is highlight this Dr. Jha, who's never treated a COVID patient. You know, Dr. Fareed has treated literally thousands, 1,000 high-risk patients, hasn't lost anybody. He's had the testimonials of people who have almost overnight had their symptoms, you know, dramatically reduced when they take hydroxychloroquine. I mean, I know that's an anecdote, but Dr. Risch can tell you about the studies, you know, showing the reduction in death and hospitalization from hydroxychloroquine and zinc. Again, it makes no sense, but the resistance in the media, the medical journals, academia, you know, just, you know, hospital associations, all, you know, pharmacist associations, medical boards, all these individuals that have resisted early treatment, resisted things like hydroxychloroquine, they will never admit they are wrong, because the consequences of them admitting they're wrong are severe.
And thanks for that. Dr. Risch, you've presented, I suppose, quite a lot of evidence with respect to epidemiologic studies and the international meta-analysis. Which are the one for you, which are the most important right now that you would like to be reconsidered by the person that Senator Johnson mentioned? In essence, which would be the one?
Well, you know, as an epidemiologist, I evaluate the literature. I don't pick and choose studies in order to find the one that wants to make my case. Some of the studies are indeed stronger and some are weaker, but the whole body of information is what matters. This was set out in 1965 in an essay by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who was a biostatistician and epidemiologist, on causal reasoning in epidemiology. And what we do since that time, that's accepted the world over by every government, every advisory committee, every regulatory committee, in how to evaluate epidemiologic evidence, is to synthesize it, to look at how big the associations are and how consistent they are across countries, across people, across time, across different kinds of studies, and to look at the various other parameters about the nature of the relationships one is studying, and to put all of that together to make the case for or against what one sees. And this is why the evidence for hydroxychloroquine in early outpatient treatment of high-risk people is overwhelming. It's because we have 7 studies in different parts of the world using different technologies for the studies, all showing the same thing. The strongest study is perhaps the one in Saudi Arabia, because it had close to 8,000 people. It was a national study done over 3 weeks of just everyone in the country, and the patients who received hydroxychloroquine and zinc did substantially better than the patients who received zinc alone. It cut their mortality by 4 to 5-fold, which is a huge amount of benefit compared to what one sees just in standard of care treatment. And in a large study such as this, one is very hard pressed to say that it was somehow a biased sample of people in the country, because it was everybody in the country who got COVID over 3 weeks that was detected by tests, by PCR tests in the country. These are very strong pieces of evidence. Plus, the randomized controlled trials when taken together of outpatients, and these are weak studies, even though they're randomized, they're weak studies because they used people who were too young and too at low risk. Nevertheless, there are now 7 studies. One just was released a couple days ago, and included in all of the other studies, there are now 7 studies, and they show significant benefit of mortality or hospitalization for taking hydroxychloroquine. And that's the evidence that you can't hide behind a blanket statement of there's no evidence and just say, oh, I'm pontificating, there's no evidence, done. Okay, that doesn't deal with evidence. Dealing with evidence means evaluating the studies and evaluating all of the studies, and all of the studies show overwhelming benefit for this. That's where the science is.
Surely your expertise and that of your colleagues and other doctors in the US is numerous number of years, and the same that we have in France. Why do you feel this expertise is not listened to? I mean, what's happening in the world that suddenly we don't listen to expertise anymore?
Well, as the senator said, this has been politicized and thwarted by massive scale propaganda that comes through the mass media, through the medical journals that have been bought off for the last 50. When I was in medical school in the 1970s, we already, as medical students, thought to reject the advances, the blandishments of the drug companies that were sending us books and stethoscopes and other things for free in order to develop relationships with us. That was then, and this has proceeded continuously since then, to the point where there are so many people who are allegiant to drug companies, including the medical journals, journal editors, reviewers, the medical media, and so on. It's created a climate where peer review now on things related to drug company interests are totally out the window. The peer review climate today is nonsense for those kinds of topics, which includes topics that show benefit of hydroxychloroquine in COVID. Those studies are slow walked and rejected from peer-reviewed media today because of suppression, because of the interests of the journal editors and reviewers. And that's the climate. And that's why peer review today is not a standard. One has to look at studies on preprint servers like medRxiv and evaluate them for yourself using your own scientific expertise. And that's the standard of medicine today, unfortunately.
Thanks. Just since we're talking about studies, and that's probably for the two of you too, because I'd like to get the view from the senator as well on the Lancet Gate study, which in essence that started a big, I would say, that threw a big ball in the ocean, and suddenly it threw a lot of turmoil around medical doctors and in the media as well. Such a prestigious medical journal as the Lancet, who is a peer review, you should have expected very high standards, and therefore people can be dazzled or by this. Is there currently an investigation or a criminal investigation, or are there any charges which are being faced by the parties that brought this turmoil to, I would say, science?
I'll say not that I'm aware of. You know, obviously, we just heard in testimony about that study in Lancet, and then also one in the New England Journal of Medicine that scared the you-know-what out of people, poisoned the atmosphere around hydroxychloroquine, and quite honestly, that had a spillover effect on any off-the-shelf drug being proposed or being utilized for early treatment. So it poisoned the well. But then those studies were withdrawn a couple weeks later. They'd already done the damage, but they're withdrawn very quietly with an admission that they were fraudulent. I mean, this is jaw-dropping. That should have been enormous news. The studies themselves were enormous news. They poisoned the well. They really were. We had one anecdotal story that came into our website talking about a woman in Texas whose husband got COVID. She wanted to get hydroxychloroquine and zinc from their primary care physician. Because of those studies, the doctor said, no, it looks like it's dangerous. It doesn't work, you know? So her husband was denied treatment, early treatment. He died. She contracted COVID. she wasn't willing to sit by and just not be treated. So she got hydroxychloroquine. Her symptoms were dramatically reduced within 24 hours. I mean, again, there's an anecdote, but there are hundreds, probably thousands of those types of anecdotes that people like Dr. Jha, first of all, because he's not treating COVID patients, he wouldn't know, he wouldn't have firsthand experience. And then he claims, well, there's no evidence. Well, it's because he's not looking for evidence. The press isn't looking for evidence. They're looking for confirmation that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work or that it's dangerous. And anytime they find confirmation, for example, through a Democrat witness in a US Senate hearing that says, oh, there's no evidence that this is dangerous, it doesn't do any good, they will continue to amplify that. And that is exactly what we've seen in the few days after a hearing. The press is amplifying that viewpoint, the viewpoint of those fraudulent studies in the Lancet, and they are ignoring the expert testimony of people like Dr. Risch and Dr. McCulloch and Dr. Fareed. They are ignoring it. They're just, it's like it doesn't even exist, while they continue to report that there's no evidence that this stuff's work. In fact, the evidence is that it doesn't work, and the evidence is that it's dangerous. I can't explain it. I think part of the explanation is because President Trump uttered the words hydroxychloroquine, and so it just became immediately politicized there. And as I said earlier, I think you do have to follow the money in the fact that hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and a Z-Pak cost $20, and remdesivir, which can only be administered in the hospital intravenously, has apparently some pretty serious side effects from a standpoint of liver toxicity. That's the standard of care, but it costs more than $3,000, which happens to benefit pharmaceutical companies. I don't know. I don't have exact proof of that, but it sure looks suspicious, and it's worthy of investigation.
And recently,
one other thing, which is that the New England Journal is also guilty of the retraction paper, but it started even before the president said anything about hydroxychloroquine. In February of this year, the New England Journal published a paper by British statisticians and clinicians saying the magic of randomization and the myth of real-world evidence. This paper was an entire screed against the entire field of epidemiology. It was chock full of errors and misrepresentations and lack of understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of randomized controlled trials. It pretended to be an authoritative statement about randomized controlled trials put out by people who are almost entirely funded by drug companies. And that was in the New England Journal before the president said anything. It shows you to what degree the drug companies have affected what gets put out by the journals. And this is why the journals, the New England Journal and Lancet, were fertile ground for the retracted papers, because they knew that this stuff could come out easily, because that's what the journal editors wanted to see, because of supporting the drug company interests that they were facing.
That's we'll come back to that in a few minutes. One of the things that we have noticed is the hearing has had a lot of followers on the internet, a lot from the social networks, probably more than you've had from your colleagues, or whether it's in Congress or in medical. And we've observed something very similar in France, is that the Professor Rao has had a lot of followers that were members of the general public, but these members of the general public can be microbiologists, statisticians, scientists, and not necessarily in the medical field. Do you observe the same thing in the US, and do you take this into consideration as well?
Yeah, I think it's a very sad state of affairs in the world, also in the US, where people are losing confidence in their institutions. And I could go into a host of examples of that, but we're talking about this one when it comes to our medical bureaucracies and medical journals and associations. It's not good when these institutions have done things that have reduced their credibility, reduced their level of integrity. It's just not a good state of affairs, which is why people are trying to get information from the internet. But so much of this information that we're trying to get out is being censored by the internet. Peter McCulloch, Dr. McCulloch, he had a video of himself just relaying his own experience he enrolled in a FDA-approved trial in hydroxychloroquine, and it worked. And that video was censored by, I believe, YouTube. Our office tried to help him get that reestablished. So we have such resistance in our society, in our media, the institutions, and people are understanding that. I mean, the fact that 73 million Americans voted for President Trump shows you that there's at least 72 or 73 million Americans that aren't believing the mainstream media. And so they are looking for alternatives. And so they're looking to the internet. They're trying to find information because the bottom line is people are afraid of COVID, and they have a legitimate reason for being afraid of it. And they're not satisfied with the NIH guidelines, which says if you have symptoms, get a test and then go home and wait. And wait to the point you get so sick, you have to go into the emergency room, you have to go to the hospital and possibly get put on a ventilator. And of course, you all know the results of ventilators is not promising. People don't believe that is compassionate care. They are looking for alternatives. Our agencies, our media, our medical institutions, our medical journals aren't providing the alternative. In fact, they're turning their face away any evidence presented by people like Dr. Risch and Dr. McCulloch and Dr. Fareed. They're just ignoring it. And so rational people, people that actually do believe, what makes sense with any virus is treat it early, stop the replication. You'll lower the severity of the symptoms. They are looking for early treatment, but they are being blocked by the media, by our agencies. It's a very sad state of affairs.
Censorship is really very important. Dr. Risch, do you feel the same in the medical field? Because of course, in epidemiology, you've been, I would say, badly treated by some of your colleagues who dismissed some of your work. Is this some form of censorship as well, or how would you explain that?
So yes, that is true. However, I don't take this seriously because I'm a scientist and I don't make up the evidence. I'm the messenger of the evidence. Nature is speaking through all of these data, and nature doesn't lie. The data are what they are, and anybody can look at the studies and read them. I'm just saying, here are the studies, and this is how I interpret them. I think the interpretation is obvious, but anyone can look at those studies. Anyone can read the original papers and draw one's own conclusions and come to whatever you think is the right conclusion. So I have no monopoly on this opinion. It is true, I've received tens of thousands of emails, except for maybe 4 or 5. They've all been supportive. They've come from reams and reams of physicians, some PhDs in other fields, and just everyday people. Many people who are desperate to get care, who can't find physicians in their state, where I refer them to telemedicine groups that are treating people. There is an infrastructure that is working, but small and slowly, to help in this circumstance. And there are the doctors like Dr. Fareed, Dr. Zelenko, Dr. Proctor, Dr. Tyson, Dr. Kochmar in Illinois. There are doctors who are treating patients very successfully, overwhelmingly successfully. So this is an information problem that, because of the control of the information by the mass media, it's very difficult to get out, and it's limited as to how we can do it. But I think that people who take the time and effort to find us are finding out how they have to deal with it. And it's been extremely supportive, remarkably supportive, because it's obvious that when you read the studies, you understand them.
Thanks. One other question with respect to the system in the US. There seem to have been some studies or some observation that in some states there were some where HCQ was actually prescribed versus where it was prohibited, where you had lower death rates or at least lower lethality rates. Have you observed this, or have you?
And this applies to countries, for example, India, Algeria, Morocco, Russia, perhaps, countries that have been using hydroxychloroquine for a long time, or chloroquine in some cases for a long time, that have much lower mortality rates than we have. India, for example, has a mortality of under 100 per million, 100 cases, 100 deaths per million cases, whereas we're close to 800 deaths per million cases. And that's a big problem because they're doing something that we're not, and it's working for them, and we're not doing it. And it could be working for us, but we're not willing to entertain it. And so, you know, this is empirical evidence as to why aren't we even looking at what they're doing, let alone saying what it is? Why aren't we looking at it? It's because of a willful blindness to encourage that in order to create fertile ground for products that cannot compete in the marketplace for what we need. When you have two products, one that costs $20 and one that costs $3,000, the marketplace for a level marketplace, a level playing field, will favor the $20 product if it does as well as the $3,000 one. And so the marketplace must be distorted in order to make room for an expensive product, and that is what we face.
Let me also add, you know, I champion the right to try bill here in the U.S., which gives patients and their doctors the ability to try non-FDA approved drugs that have gone through the safety approval process, but still haven't gone through the efficacy approval process. That's a law of our land. And yet here we have, for example, hydroxychloroquine, a drug that has been available for 65 years. Dr. Risch talks about tens of billions of doses worldwide have been prescribed. And you have doctors who are using their off-label prescription rights. It's not approved for COVID because COVID didn't exist. But they have off-label prescription rights, so they write prescriptions and pharmacists won't fill them, or they grill the patients, or people have to split up the prescription to hydroxychloroquine at this pharmacist and to get their, you know, azithromycin at a different pharmacist. So I reported one doctor called me. She'd written 4 prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine. She had a grand jury summons, or she had a summons to a grand jury by the Homeland Security investigation team. I mean, that's the kind of persecution. Of course, we mentioned what is happening to Dr. Raoul in France and what's happening to doctors in Queensland, Australia. There is something going on here. It is not right. And we need to find out and get to the bottom of it so we can save lives.
Especially when it comes down to remdesivir, the World Health Organization put out very recently a statement saying that remdesivir was not useful. We have observed in France, or at least in the Solidarity trial, that some of the clinical trial doctors were still pursuing the inclusion of that drug in the trial, despite the fact that the World Health Organization is saying that it's not helping patients, or it's not proving efficacy. Do you have the same situation in the US where the remdesivir is still including in clinical trials?
It probably is. That I'm not sure about clinical trials. It's probably used in hospitals quite widely because a lot of the reason is they don't have that much that they actually know about to use. And now that we have, you know, we've had convalescent plasma for a while, we're getting monoclonal antibodies. They may work. We have to see how that works, but we have very thin evidence so far, and we need more. So even in the hospital, we're still evolving how things work. But the interesting thing is that the role of the WHO in spreading misinformation for months, and suddenly people are relying on it or not relying on it, and both sides are laying claim to what the WHO says. And this seems bizarre to me because the WHO hasn't been putting out accurate information. It's hidden now 3 scandals of information, the latest being the epidemic in the WHO building. So I don't know why people are actually believing what comes out of the WHO in the first place.
Turning over to just the, you've talked a lot about the role of the pharma company, but we've seen Pfizer and Moderna Therapeutics last week that have announced preliminary results for their vaccine. One of my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the US, in order for a vaccine to be approved, one of the conditions is that there are no alternative syrup of the shelf therapies or drugs. Is this correct? And do you think that could be a motive for the drug company to dismiss early treatments?
I thought that was true at the beginning. That is what is in the written details of how the FDA reviews drugs and vaccines for emergency use authorizations. But we've seen the FDA run amok. We've seen them make arbitrary decisions and not hold to standards and not hold to evidence. And there's no reason to believe that they would hold to that any more than they hold to anything else. So they've been capricious. They've used double standards. They've discarded large evidence for hydroxychloroquine in favor of weak evidence for remdesivir. And it's obvious not because of the science. They have other motivations for why they've chosen to do that. So I have no reason to believe that they would do anything with regard to the first horse out of the gate restriction on emergency use authorizations. I think they're just going to do what they choose to do in spite of that.
And if we come back as my last question to the hearing of last week, what's next? Is there some further evidence that you have to give? Because it wasn't very clear from us of what were the next steps. Senator Johnson, maybe? Well,
let me first say what has been bizarre to me throughout this. Again, we're in the midst of a pandemic. It's not like we're talking about some disease that's been around forever, and we just continue to battle it, and we're going to try a different drug, and we've got the time to go through random controlled trials, and this is a pandemic. And what has surprised me is how doctors that have the courage to treat patients for COVID are being largely ignored here. Where we're paying attention to all these, people trained in medicine but have never really practiced medicine. They've just done research in institutions, or they're sitting here in the agencies, and they apparently are the gods of information. But the people in the trenches, the doctors and nurses that are actually getting results, we're just completely dismissing. We're completely ignoring them. So one of the things I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get as much of that, as many practicing physicians, practicing nurses to come forward and provide their stories. And I want patients who have been treated to provide those stories. Yes, I know it's anecdotal, but why would we dismiss anecdotal evidence? I mean, when you've got a doctor like, Dr. Farid, who's literally treated 1,000 high-risk patients, thousands of other COVID patients, I don't believe he's lost one yet. When he prescribes his protocol of hydroxychloroquine and zinc, and I think they also throw azithromycin in there as well. And he hears from patients that they're turning around in a day or two. Their symptoms are dramatically reduced, versus other people that aren't being treated. This thing can linger for weeks and even longer. Why aren't we listening to the real world experience? So in terms of answering your question, where does this go from here? I'm going to have another hearing. We were going to do it next week. I want to make sure I really understand what it's going to be about. But I think there's plenty to investigate here. I mean, I'm chairman of the Senate Oversight Committee. We need to take a look at these financial ties of people on this NIH panel that is looking at these drugs and having a great deal of influence on what's approved and what's not approved. Why was remdesivir rushed into use? And why was the outcome changed in the trial where there's no reduction of death, but a reduction in hospitalization? So then they switched the outcome. I have all kinds of questions, but the one on top of my mind is, why are we ignoring eminently qualified experts, people like Dr. Risch, Dr. McCulloch, people that have treated thousands of patients successfully? Early treatment, like Dr. Fried. Why are these voices being ignored and marginalized and by the press discredited? Why is this happening? Why are we listening to people, junior doctors that have no experience treating people with COVID, like Dr. Jha? Why is the press listening to people like that? They should be listening to real world experience and to the doctors that I called as witnesses.
In a word, that's good sense. what you're saying. Let's listen to good sense and experience. And Dr. Risch, you're gonna continue to testify as well, or are there any other?
Any role that I can play that helps to save lives is what I'm doing. I got into this in the first place because of that factor of that we were losing lives unnecessarily, and the science says what the science says, and censoring it doesn't make the science go away. The science is still there. And so everything we can do to save lives is important. You know, we've had the clinicians in the United States, they've probably seen at least 10,000 high-risk patients now with half a dozen lives lost out of huge numbers of people who were saved. That is not anecdotal evidence. You can't just start saying these tens of thousands of people whose lives were saved is anecdotal evidence. Think about it. If you get sick, are you going to go to Dr. Jha? Are you going to go to the NIH? Are you going to go to the FDA for treatment? No, you're going to go to Dr. Zelenko or Dr. Proctor or Dr. Farid and so on. Those are the people you're going to go to. Anybody with half an ounce of any thought will go to those doctors in spite of their politicization or other reasons for shunning those ideas. The first thing they will do is go to those doctors to get their lives saved. So this is the big disconnect, that even the people who are mounting this absurd argument that there's no evidence know that if they get sick, they're going to go get treated early. And it's a complete dishonesty on their part.
Thanks a lot. And I don't know, Senator Johnson, if you want to have anything else to our French readers. But what I can say is that I really thank you for taking the time to explain to us what's happening in the US. And I can only say thank you on behalf of the readers of France Soir, because I do believe that's by sharing this experience and applying good sense, then we may end up to get out of this mess. And that's why I reached out to you. I probably will reach out to you again once you get the second hearing, if I may, because like this, I can update our readers, and anything you want to ask us about what's happening in France that can be of help, very happy to provide to you as well.
I want to thank you for interviewing us and highlighting this. And to any listener, be your own advocate. If you get COVID, don't go home and just ignore it. Seek early treatment. Find one of those courageous medical practitioners, a doctor, a nurse, somebody who is willing to actually treat you early. Somebody who's willing to practice medicine. You have to advocate for yourself. Don't listen to the bureaucrats. Don't listen to the media. You have common sense, as Dr. Risch was talking about. Use it and get early treatment.
Well, thanks a lot to the two of you for that. And wish you to have a very good day then.
Thank you.
Take care. God bless you. Bye, Doctor.